Everybody, we are going to talk really quickly about counter arguments because counter arguments are one of the big things that you're going to need to add to your essay number 2. So let's go ahead and jump right into counter arguments. And so you might ask, why is a counter argument necessary, and might it even hurt my argument if I'm bringing in opposing views, people who disagree with my thesis? Well, no, it actually helps your argument because it helps establish and support your own ethos. So if you remember all the way back what feels like years ago, when we talked about ethos, pathos, and logos, ethos is the credibility of the writer or the speaker. So actually, including a counter argument helps your own credibility, it helps your own ethos because it allows the reader to see that, one, you've done enough research about your topic to understand that there are multiple points of view, and two, that you're fair-minded enough to be able to understand and then address those other points of view. So actually, including a counter argument helps your argument in that way. So let's talk about where a counter argument might come into your essay. There's no one place where you can say this is where the counter argument goes. It depends on a couple things. So again, remember back with me a couple, 5, 6, 7 years ago, when we talked about arrangement, we talked about the different parts of an argument in classical rhetoric. And so number 5 was where arguments can damage a rhetoric's case. They're anticipated and then refuted. And this is what we're talking about here. This is the counter argument. So where you put the counter argument really depends on what kind of argument you're making, but also who you're making that argument to. So it depends on your thesis, and then it also depends on your audience. So if you have, remember our honorable case, which is an argument that has immediate support from its audience, you probably don't have to worry too much about the counter argument. You may want to put it down below toward the end of the argument, just as kind of a way to say, look, I've anticipated these things. However, if you have a difficult case where your audience is unsympathetic to your argument or to the issue, you may actually want to start with the counter argument to just kind of head off the objections that your audience is already going to have. So really, where you put the counter argument has everything to do with what kind of argument you think you're making. Are you making a difficult argument to a hostile audience? Are you making an honorable argument to a sympathetic audience? So that brings us to the how. So how do we make a counter argument? How do you include opposing views into your essay and then explain to your reader why your argument's better? Well, there's 3 big parts of a counter argument. The first one is summary of opposing view, and this is where you describe the opposing view to your argument. The second is a concession, where you acknowledge some good things about that opposing view. And then the third is the rebuttal. And this is where you counterattack. It's where your counter argument comes in. It's where you explain to your reader why those opposing views aren't as valid as yours, aren't as good as yours, or why your argument is better than those opposing views. So let's go to the first one, the opposing view. So usually the summary of the opposing view is actually not short. It's a little bit lengthy, 3 to 5 sentences that summarizes and then explains that opposing view or the argument that opposes your thesis. So it's something you've done. It's something you've done with all your sources where you've summarized a source. This time you're just summarizing a source that happens to disagree with you. One of the things that you want to think about is using credible sources to support these opposing views. You don't want to use sources that can be easily dismissed. You want to use the strongest sources you can to really show that you're taking this opposing view seriously. And as you're explaining these things, you want to do it in neutral, objective terms. You don't want to say, this idiot says. You want to explain those opposing views as if they are legitimate opposing views. So some of the ways that you might start to do this is to begin this section by saying some may believe, others might say, or it's been argued. What you're doing there is you're shifting into a summary of someone who disagrees with you, but you're also letting your reader know that these aren't necessarily your views, These are different views. These are opposing views. So here is what a summary of an opposing view may look like. I'll just read it for you really quickly. And let's pretend for this exercise that I'm writing an essay about why I think Parks and Recreation is a better show than The Office. And so I spent all this time making this argument in my essay, but I know that I'm going to have to address this opposing view. So I might start out by saying, not everyone agrees that Parks and Rec is a superior show to The Office. Kevin Kraft argues in The Atlantic that The Office represents the best that TV has to offer, and then you quote from that opposing view, from that opposing source. Citing its groundbreaking format, Kraft called The Office television comedy at its best. And so what I've done here is I've said, look, this is what the opposing view is. I haven't said it's wrong yet. I've just said, here's what it is. It's a simple summary of that view. After that, though, after the summary is when you move into concessions. And so a concession is usually one or two sentences that acknowledge that the other side of the argument might have a point. Maybe it's valid, or maybe even if it's wrong, they are making this argument out of goodwill. So the tone should be respectable to establish your own ethos. Sorry for the typo there, I just caught that. Even if the argument is wrong, you can always acknowledge that the person is making the argument in good faith because they want things to be better, right? So the idea here is to acknowledge if there's parts of the argument that you agree with, tell your audience that. Even if there's not parts that you agree with, you can say, well, they say this, and we can understand why they might say that. So concessions can begin with although, even though, wow, and words like though. And so that allows your reader to make that kind of mental note that we're switching from summary into concession. And so a sample concession again might be something like, it's true that The Office was a groundbreaking show in terms of format and character development. Not many would argue that it's not among the best shows of the early 20th century. So you're saying, look, it is groundbreaking in this way. It's a really good show. All of these things are true. And that leads us then to the most important part of the counterargument, which is the rebuttal. The rebuttal is where you explain why the opposing view is wrong, invalid, or just basically doesn't matter. So the rebuttal can do a couple different things. It can challenge specific claims or evidence from the opposing view. So it can say, well, it says this specifically, but I think that's wrong because of this. Or it can say, it uses this piece of evidence, but really what this piece of evidence shows is something different. Or it can explain why the view does not apply to your argument. They say this, but really my argument is different. Or you can point out why the logic of the opposing view is faulty. Well, this is a non sequitur, or this is an ad hominem attack and it doesn't really make sense. So rebuttals often begin with, however, on the other hand, but what this view or what this source doesn't understand or acknowledge. So you're transitioning into your own claim, your own argument here. And so a rebuttal might look something like this. But Kraft doesn't take into account one of the things that make TV shows both rewatchable and meaningful. It's implicit worldview. The world of The Office is one of laughs, but those laughs often come with a dismissive sneer. Its humor, while often entertaining, has nothing under it except a stale whiff of nihilism. We as viewers aren't asked to care about the lives of the characters on The Office. They are all like those mostly forgettable office mates we've all had, entertaining for a short part of time, but not worth a second thought once 5 p.m. rolls around. So you're explaining why this particular opposing view doesn't work. And so here's our paragraph all put together. So you can see that we start with our opposing view, the summary there. We transition into a concession, and then we end with the rebuttal. You don't have to do this all in one paragraph. Oftentimes, people might do these two parts in one paragraph, the opposing view and the concession, and then they might do the rebuttal as its own paragraph, particularly if you're bringing in lots of evidence to counter that. So oftentimes, a counter argument can be 1, 2, 3, maybe even more paragraphs. So don't feel like you have to limit yourself to one paragraph. A really good rebuttal or a really good counter argument really takes about 2 or 3 paragraphs. So again, those are the 3 big parts: the summary of the opposing view, the concession, and then rebuttal. As you're working on this, if you have any questions, or you want to talk through what you're working on, please let me know. But I'm excited to see what you do with SA2.